Good afternoon from Geneva to all of you. My name is Jean-Michel Rousseau. I'm the Deputy Head of the Business and Security Team at DCAF, and we're very pleased today to welcome you all to another one of our episode in our panel in our webinar series on whether there is a new wave in private military and security companies and what can be done to address this wave. And this is something that is born out of some reflections we've had in particularly since the last year on seeing new actors in the market now for some time with characteristics that still place them within the field of private military and security companies, but with some different characteristics, say, to companies we saw in the 2000s in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. And so we've been trying to analyze this more in depth to see what are international norms, good practices, because they exist. Are they up to date? Are they relevant? And what are the lessons learned already from work done by DCAF and others in strengthening PMSC regulation that are applicable also to these new set of companies. Just something I think to stress from our side is, our starting point is not about saying, countries should hire PMSCs or not. I think as an organization, we have not taken a position on this, but I think our position has consistently been, if countries decide to hire PMSCs or if private actors would do so, then this needs to be adequately framed and structured and regulated. The types of services that are allowed should be clearly clear, based also on international human rights law and international humanitarian law. There needs to be an adequate regulation mechanism in place at all the different states involved. So it's to say, if states based on a solid international law grounding and obviously national law grounding as well permit these companies to operate, then they should be adequately regulated in the operations, monitored, held accountable, etc. I think that's been the starting point of our reflection. And we kicked it off last year. We had a general kickoff webinar last year. We've since done a second episode that was actually focused on Haiti, where we also had contractors involved in around recent unrest in the country and around the killing of the head of state in Haiti. In circumstances are unclear, so the full involvement still is unclear. But there was, it took place in a context where we had a deployment of PMSCs, and today we wanted to turn the attention to another country, another region, and that's Yemen, where we've seen the presence of private military and security companies throughout the last years. And to aerate a bit, like, what is the situation, how have they been used, and what are ways to address this, and also to benefit maybe from some other lessons learned, some viewpoints from other states in the Middle East and North Africa, work that has been done on PMSCs in the other contexts. The format today is supposed to be, it's a short format, it's supposed to be executive to allow people to tune in. Obviously, we'll make the recording available. We'll be able for follow-up discussions, but the idea is to have shorter inputs that allow a number, as many people as possible to tune into the discussions. And with that, I'd like to turn over first to the speakers, and just in terms of structure, we'll have inputs from the speakers, maybe some questions from me, and then we'll open up as well to the audience to have hopefully an animated discussion and a relevant discussion. I'd like to start with our first speaker, which is Ahmed Nagy, who is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. I don't think we have to introduce the center. It's a very well-known center working on a lot of important security issues in the region. Your research centers on Yemen. I won't go through all the things because I think I'd exhaust the hour that we have available, but also to say you also a country coordinator in Yemen for Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is based in Sweden. You're also co-founder of the Inside Source Center for Research and Consulting, and you were previously also working for a foundation in Lebanon. And I think with that, very ample experience. Maybe if you could give us a bit of a certain framing, in terms of the country we're talking about, the dynamics in the last years in Yemen, and if you have to look at the challenges to peace, how do you rate, and stability, how do you rate the presence of the operation of private military and security companies as one of these, well, challenges, potentially also stabilizing factors, but how would you raise what would you be take on the impact? And I think something also that you work on as well is when it comes to weapons, etc. Maybe there's also an overlap between these companies and the arms trade, so maybe also something to look at. But over to you, if you can give us a brief. I mean, I know we could talk for hours and weeks on Yemen and as every other country, but if you can give us a bit of framing, particularly in terms of private military and security companies, that would be great.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. When we look at Yemen today, after around 7 years of ongoing conflict, which started in 2014, and then deteriorated by the Saudi-led coalition military operations in 2015. Yemen today is divided actually in two main parts, but this is actually not only the case. Actually, within the two parts, there are so many divisions. So in the first part, which is in the north of Yemen, we have the Houthis and Salah movement, and on the other side, we have now the internationally recognized government with the Presidential Leadership Council, which was formed just last month, containing all the military actors who are active on the ground. And this is, the final, let's say, outcome of the 7 years of conflict. I will not go in details about this matter, but I will just talk about the why we are seeing the Presidential Council in this at this moment. I think this is related to the transformation of the Saudi-led coalition strategy, because at the beginning of the conflict, they were insisting on just the military solutions, and they announced that their operation just to restore the legitimate government and to defeat the Houthis. But by time passed, these things actually became totally different, and we ended up with so many fragmentations, and the war came home, unfortunately, and Saudis actually became and Saudi and the UAE became the target of the Houthi drones and plastic missiles and so on. So now they are thinking about this kind of strategy. In terms of the situation related to the private security and military companies, I think we can look at it from two tracks. But before that, let me just say something. I mean, we always analyze Yemen, the conflict in Yemen from humanitarian perspective, from different kind of angles. But we can, when it comes to the private military companies, we need to look at the conflict in Yemen from the market lens. It's like a business for so many warlords, for so many companies, for so many actors. And under this big title, we can see how things are going on the ground. So we have, as I mentioned, two tracks. The first one, the private companies or the private security military companies, as we know, which is divided into three categories. The first one is the international security companies. I assume you heard about the Spear Operations Group, which was hired by the United Arab Emirates to conduct some sort of assassination, and this was covered by so many, foreign newspaper about this issue. But we still have so many companies that we don't know about. And the second type in this track is the international security companies that provide some sort of trainings and consulting for the Saudi-led coalition, the UAE and Saudis. And the third category, and this is the local companies, which was actually active before the conflict, but they are continuing working in some parts of the country. And these kind of local companies are providing some security services for international organizations, some oil companies, and so on. But this kind of category became, less active during the conflict because, the conflict dynamics didn't allow them to function as usual. So, and here we can see, I mean, the different categories, but we still have actually another part of private, let's say, not companies, but entities, which are working as private companies. I mean, the function of private companies are done by these kind of entities. And here we can see the local private companies that trained by or built from scratch by the United Arab Emirates and Saudis in some part of the country. And here we can name so many entities. The Salafis part of these entities, some separatist groups are also part of these entities, and the difference between the private companies, as we know, and these entities actually doing the same function, but they have a cause in front of the audience. And at the same time, and here actually why the Saudi-led coalition from the beginning preferred to go with this idea, because they didn't trust the governmental forces. And here I just recall what Ronald Reagan said, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem itself. So they thought that the Yemeni governmental forces are not capable enough to carry out their agendas. So they built something from scratch. And the second type of these entities is the Borderland Fighters. And here we saw at some moments the Saudis are recruiting large number of Yemeni youth to fight in the borderlands to defend their borders. And they are working actually in the recruitment process through tribal contractors. And we see here the local dimension of this process. And again, on the other side, in the Houthi controlled areas, the Houthis actually, when they took over Sana'a in 2014, they didn't count on the traditional institutions. They built their own, let's say, parallel security structure, which called actually the supervisors system. And they just built this parallel system, and through it, they managed to control every single area under their control. And this kind of structure is linked directly to the leader of the group. But more interestingly, actually, within this structure, they have some private groups which are working in just specific mission. For example, they have some groups working in close to the front lines, and they have just very specific missions to do. Some groups working near the borders, and they have just very specific missions. And here we can see how the private, let's say, entities or private companies have some sort of hybrid functions, where if we add to it a local dimension. I will stop here, and if there is any question, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you. That was actually really concise, but I think really, to the point, and that very much appreciated. Maybe if I think we'll have a set of questions after. I think I'll turn over to the other speaker in the first moment, and I'd like to pass the floor over to Matthew, I think, as a second speaker. Just on the background, I mean, Matthew is an academic specializing in the field of security studies, authoritarianism, a strong specialization on the Arabian Peninsula, and currently you are working at the University of Exeter in in the UK. I think, I think Ahmed has given us an introduction to the national dynamics, but still obviously with the regional perspectives as play as well. But maybe if you could broaden a bit, because I think for us the idea is to also look, what are the regional and global dynamics impacting the use of private military and security companies in specific contexts. So, if you look at it from a regional security perspective, what is the interest of contracting the PMSCs in conflict? Why are PMSCs used? In the country we're talking about? Is this a new way of dealing with regional security challenges? What is the overall role of private military security companies in a conflict like the one we are discussing today?
Sure. And I'm going to ask, thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this talk. Hanan, I'll keep an eye on you to see if you throw your hands up in the air if I start saying something which might step on your toes. So PMCs, paramilitary contractors, companies, those types of actors and players are a useful way to optimize, to augment, to replace soldiers of, you could have mercenaries with rifles, as Ahmed was saying about the Emiratis having an assassination squad in South Yemen. This was back in, it was at its height, 2017-18, assassinating Salafi sheikhs and this sort of thing. But that would go to the complete other end of, as you've said, say training. It could be logistics, helping send, tools, weapons, people across the entirety of a state which isn't really capable of managing itself, but also extremely vulnerable to the lack of government oversight. These abuses then start to, they become endemic. For Saudi Arabia, since the death of Prince Sultan in, was it 2010, 9-10, the Saudis basically lost control of their network within Yemen. And as a result, their networks, their efficiency, their ability to conduct operations and involvement severely weakened. This then further accelerated with the death of Ali Abdullah Salah. And so they've had to try and find another way to augment their ability to exercise power in what's known as their own backyard, so to say. For the Emiratis, they've always had a human manpower deficiency. Their armed forces are very small, but also what we've seen is that they are extremely sensitive and vulnerable to the deaths of their own soldiers within Yemen and its impact on social dynamics therein. So as a result, it's always been useful for these types of states to replace their own soldiers with those which don't carry the same war fatigue within society. They aren't attributable often to the actions of the UAE armed forces. I think one of the clearest ways is, having forces such as the under Hemeti, the Rapid Reaction Forces of Sudan, or as it's well known, the Janjaweed. Were they an official military contributor? Were they privately contracted? And if they're privately contracted, what on earth are the dynamics, the structures, which then bring in this force which was accused of genocide in Sudan into a civil war? Who's it fighting for what objectives, what benefits? And it really raises some serious questions. You then have the last difficulty, and this is what I'll say before I stop, is the complete collapse of rule of law and like jurisprudence, and the polarization of society and politics within Yemen has enabled this complete systemic abuse of power across the country. And so it's extremely difficult to go and find evidence of PMCs, of these private security contractors operating. So some of the only ones that we have seen are when states, mess up, or when somebody else wants to point a finger. We've seen the Emirati Red Crescent being involved in shipping guns, weapons to Socotra and other parts of the country. But then you've also seen it with foreign oil companies, as Ahmed was saying, and the two largest ones were Total in Balhaf, the oil facilities, and their involvement in torture prisons. Well, not Total itself, but were on their premises. These facilities were being operated. And then the next now currently is the Austrian oil company, who is seeking to exit Yemen, again, because of those potential legal vulnerabilities, which may turn back onto them because of that complete lack of oversight. I will leave it there, so there's much more time for questions. But thank you again for listening, and look forward to speaking more.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I think that was, you also made, I think, a good transition as well to Hanan Salah, which is our third speaker. Just to introduce her briefly, I think, most people working on the region know her very well by now and the work she's been doing, but just to introduce her, Hanan is a senior Libya researcher at the MENA division of Human Rights Watch. She previously worked for the International Committee of the Red Cross in a number of countries in the region, I believe. And she's also worked for Hilfswerk before, which is an Austrian humanitarian organization. So I think, somebody that will help us also to understand, I think, the challenges that PMSCs are posing to human rights, particularly in the region. And then I know that, your focus is on Libya. So I think, I'll ask you questions on Libya, but obviously if you have elements to extrapolate on Yemen, I think that would be very welcome for the discussion. And from what I understand, you have been, as part of the research you've been doing for years, but PMSCs are something that you have looked into, the current situation of PMSCs in Libya, and in terms of also the human rights violations that have happened under their watch. And and maybe if you could give us a bit of introduction on this, what are the key challenges posed by these actors specifically, as opposed to other actors involved in conflict? What are the specific risks associated with private military and security companies? Because I'm asking that because we do see sometimes a bit everything gets bundled together, and all the actors are posing risks, but I think it's important to also talk about specific risks that come out of the use of private military and security companies. And then also, in terms of the conflict in Libya, what are the status right now? Supposedly foreign actors were supposed to leave Libya, but where in the current peace process in Libya, what is the state of PMSCs, and what can also be maybe of relevant use there for the process going on in Yemen?
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for your introduction, and I'm very honored to be here. And some of the comments I will make will probably overlap with what Matthew and Ahmed said, but I'll try to keep it short and try to respond to all the issues that you raised. So, for the presence of foreign fighters in Libya is by no means a new phenomenon. They've been operating in Libya in different capacities since at least 2011, but we also know that beyond that, during the Gaddafi years, there was also a presence and use of foreign fighters as such. I think that, throughout the years, we have seen, though, a bit of a change in how the different governments or the very large armed groups that control specific parts of the country have used foreign fighters. At times, they were merged into the forces, and they were merged as groups or as individuals. And more recently, we have seen a bit more with more recently, I mean, since 2018, a little bit beyond, around 2018, the emergence more of the private military security companies, at least coming into the light a little bit more. It was very interesting to listen to Matthew and Ahmed describe the situation in Yemen, and particularly, I think the role of the UAE is important, and I see a major overlap here when it comes to Libya, because we have also seen that there are multiple companies that are registered in the UAE that have been involved one way or another, private military companies that are registered in the UAE and that have been involved one way or another in the conflict in Libya. And like I said, it became more prominent in 2018, very likely that there is probably activity even beyond that. So I would say that the shift a little bit is the 2018 or the conflict that started in 2019 and ended in June 2019. I think what was specific about that and what changed a little bit the scenario in Libya is that we saw an influx of foreign fighters who were well-trained, well-armed, using sophisticated weapons, typically weapons that were used by state actors, and included private contractors that were linked with the government of Russia, fighters and individuals and groups from Syria who were interestingly fighting on both sides to the conflict, some of whom were contracted as groups, and also armed groups from the Sudan and individual fighters from Sudan and Chad, again operating on both sides of the conflict. So, you know, there was a time when, particularly in the thick of it in 2019 until early 2020, it was a complicated situation of Syrians fighting each other, basically, and Sudanese fighters fighting each other in Libya. And I think it's interesting to look into that, and it's interesting to look at how the private military companies, not just were really a game changer in this conflict. So mostly we know about the presence of what's known as the Wagner Group, which is the company that is largely known to be have ties with the Kremlin. Their presence in Libya has really been a game changer. Their superior training, their use of sophisticated landmines that were not present in Libya before and not known to the groups in Libya before, their access to heavy weapons, sophisticated missile systems, anti-aircraft artillery systems, in a seemingly unending supply, really made it possible for the conflict to be stretched for 14 months. Could have been that, without their presence, my hunch is the conflict could have potentially been ended sooner. But in this case, they were really making sure that, the supply lines and that the defense lines were holding in the southern suburbs of Tripoli, where the UN-backed government, at the time, the government of National Accord, was fighting the armed groups affiliated with Khalifa Haftar from eastern Libya. That's to just name the very basics. Obviously, there were other countries who were affiliated on behalf or on supporting the eastern groups. We had support from Russia, support from the UAE, support from Egypt, and on the other side, it was mostly Turkey, with some support towards the end also from Qatar. I think that the complicating factor, and I'll end it soon, but the complicating factor is that really these foreign groups were acting in different capacities, and it was complicated, as Matthew touched upon. It's difficult to trace really the chain of command and who they actually responded to, particularly for the individuals who were merged. I would say it's not entirely a clear-cut situation. I mentioned the Wagner Group, but there was another UAE-based company, Black Shield, that came up in November 2019 when they recruited hundreds of Sudanese men who thought that they were going to work as security guards in the UAE, but ended up being shipped to Libya, to oil facilities in Libya, stayed there for some time, and I believe most of them at some point returned to their homes. But that's one of these complicated situations where it was a bit, difficult to establish the roles. I think the last point I would like to make is on accountability and how to address it, because it's an issue that is important to us. And it's a question that you raised. Given how opaque the private military companies that we're aware of that have operated and that remain in Libya, we under the Berlin political process, I can't speak of a peace process. I don't see that there's a peace process currently in Libya, but there's a protracted political process that is interspersed with fighting and interspersed with armed conflict every few years. Obviously their presence and their situation is quite opaque. They are present and remain present in Libya, particularly the Russia-linked groups. Apparently some have been extracted, but they remain present. And so do the Syrian groups. They also remain, the Syrian foreign fighters that came into Libya remain present. My main concern here, the way that obviously from our perspective, we're looking at abuses that are being committed with impunity, whether it's in placing banned landmines, whether it's possible complicity in other human rights abuses such as unlawful killings, possibly disappearances. We are seeing that, as is the case for fighters in general in Libya, foreign fighters and Libyan fighters, also private military companies are operating with impunity. There are some things that can be done about it. Libya, the International Criminal Court has a mandate to investigate in Libya, particularly war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are Libyan courts. Private military companies are prohibited by Libyan law, but we have not yet seen an incentive by these courts to, that said, the judicial system is obviously under great stress in Libya, but we have not seen them operating, on this issue. And there's, of course, the arms embargo that prohibits the use of private military companies and mercenaries, particularly, and an arms embargo which goes both ways. And we have also not seen that the arms embargo has been used to that effect. I will end my comments here, and I'm happy to take any questions to anything that I left out.
Thank you very much. And I think I know we don't have that much time, but I think the three of you have actually covered already a lot of ground. Maybe I'll go a little bit backwards. Starting with you, Hanan, and then from Matthew, and then over to Ahmed. I think maybe on the accountability part, I think you've already given us some ways. But my question was, there are a set of international norms and good practices on PMSCs that are out there. I mean, we're talking about this soft law. We don't have a convention at present, but there's the Montreux document, there's International Code of Conduct as well. What is your feeling in terms of how could these norms support potentially the accountability? I mean, both in terms of, let's say, the way they're structured, what the content is, but also the fact that it talks about the responsibilities not just of the territorial state where the PMSC is operating, but also of the home state and the contracting state. So maybe if you can, if you have some thought on that, I think that'd be helpful for us as well for our reflection.
Thank you for that question. I think the main concern when it comes to the issue of accountability is establishing really the status of these groups and what they are operating as, if they're merged with the local forces or if they're operating as a foreign private military company. Libya, just to be very clear about that, the applicable legal framework is a non-international armed conflict, which means that we are, for those out there, this means that the additional protocol and all the definitions of mercenaries, at least according to the Geneva Conventions, do not apply. Now, Libya is a signatory to the International Convention on Mercenaries and is obligated as such to to merge elements of this convention into its laws. But like I've said, the judicial system in Libya is very much under stress, and that is simply not happening. But there are some obligations under international law. I think there is a bit of a myth also to dispel that and you've mentioned the Montreux document. The contracting states very much have an obligation to ensure the respect for international humanitarian law, and it also means that the private military companies are obligated to comply with international humanitarian law or the human rights law, which is imposed by them by the applicable national law. So this means that you have a national law that includes elements of international law, and the private military companies, as a business entity, very much have an obligation to follow these laws. And that also goes for the personnel of the private military companies who are obligated to respect national law. In Libya, for example, as I'm sure is the case in Yemen, unlawful killing is prohibited, is criminalized, as is torture, as is indefinite detention, as are disappearances. The question really is a matter of impunity in this case. And I think the quintessential issue is, how can you deal with a private military company that is operating under these opaque circumstances, where there is simply no clear chain of command, there's no clear document, contract tying a private military company to a particular party to the conflict. I'm not sure that there is that there is a definitive answer to that. But I think that there again, it's important to be looking at at their status, at their chain of command, and to remember that they are obligated, like everyone else, to respect international law and to respect domestic law.
Thank you very much. And I think I'd asked the question, but I think it's also a question that was also raised in the chat. So I think that thank you very much on that. Maybe if I can go back actually to Ahmed first. In terms of the current peace process that is playing out in Yemen, or the intent to bring about peace, what do you think is the role of private military and security companies? I mean, both in terms of the impact they have on the process, but also the way they'll be dealt with in the process. What I want to say, I think Hanan was talking about Libya, and in Libya there was an agreement, as part of the peace process, that foreign fighters would leave. I mean, you've talked about the challenges in making it stick, but how do the PMCs impact the current peace process from your perspective, Ahmed? And and what are scenarios, or what could be envisioned to deal with them adequately in a peace process?
First of all, let me just add something to Hanan and Matthew's excellent insights. I think one of the key issues that we are suffering, and perhaps this is also related to the question in the chat, one of the key issues that we are suffering is the lack of accountability. And this is actually what triggers many regional and local actors to do what they are doing nowadays with civilians. And let me just tell you just an example. Even those actors know very well what they are doing is can at some point cause a problem for them. That's why they are changing their names. I mean, there are so many local leaders. They try to disappear their real names and try to come up with new names or with new nicknames that people just know them through that. And this is related to any scenario that maybe in the future they will be held accountable about their dirty acts. And to answer your question, I think there is no peace can be achieved through private military security companies. What Yemen in need nowadays is just a more reform for the state institutions, because this is not related to the the interest of individuals. This is related to the interest of public good. I mean, the interest of the society as whole. And if we just give the rule to the private military security companies, these actually entities by default are profit driven. I mean, they are looking just for more gains. They are not, peace process is not something or a big deal for them. And here we can see how these companies are working closely with rich actors, because these actors are providing them with the necessities they want. And one key issue actually we are seeing in Yemen, I still remember at the beginning of the conflict, the Saudi-led coalition, and this is actually what Matthew was mentioning, counted on the Sudanese troops in many fronts. And then by time passed, they moved this strategy and started counting on the local fighters. And here we can see so many unemployed Yemeni youth are becoming a part of these militias or fighters, because one of the key consequences of the conflict is the high rate of unemployment. And the only business they have in the Yemeni market is going to the front lines or to the battles, and so that they can raise some money. So here we can see, the more years we are seeing conflict, the more youth can be recruited by these entities. And the second thing related to the main concern that we are, thinking about nowadays in Yemen, because if we are talking just about, giving a chance for private or military companies or entities, we can see Yemenis fighting beyond the borders. I mean, I still remember in 2019, and here Hanan just, reminded me about the, links between different countries in the region. There was actually an actor who is supported by the United Arab Emirates, said that, yeah, we just achieved our missions in the areas we control, and if Khalifa bin Haftar in need to more fighters, we can send our fighters to support Khalifa Haftar. And here, another dimension of these kind of proxies, if we have no peace process, and we are just counting on these kind of entities, we end up with some sort of collaborations between them beyond the areas they belong to. They will actively be working in different areas.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Matthew, but I'll keep it for the end, just so that we can also go over to some of the chat questions. I think one question that, I think we've already talked about the accountability challenge, which I think is is key in what we're discussing. So I think that there was a question on this. There was a question on internally displaced people. If the large number of IDPs inside Yemen, like what's the interrelationship between the activities of private security companies on the one side and the large number of IDPs inside Yemen? Maybe Ahmed, maybe that might be something for you if you have any thoughts, any responses on that.
Shall I go?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. No, I was this is related to the questions on the chat, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
On the IDPs.
Yeah, because we have no access to the information of these companies. Unfortunately, everything is ambiguous in terms of who are the main contractors. And when we tried to reach some companies, they didn't actually disclose any sort of information, especially after the case of the spare operations group, because it went viral and so many American newspapers, covered the issue. And here there were actually so many international organizations asking about the accountability of such kind of work, because they are American mercenaries, or they are the company is based in the US, but they have no license to do what they are doing. And I think we saw later on some companies actually working with the regional actors, but they didn't disclose any sort of information. So the problem is not that we don't have companies. We have companies, but the problem, we don't have enough information about them.
Okay, thank you. There was a question on treatment received vis-a-vis conventional combatants. Turning to you, Hanan, maybe also with your ICRC background, whether it's something that you've seen in Libya, and you can analyze how have personnel working for PMSCs been treated as opposed to more standard combatants?
So in the decade that I've been covering Libya for Human Rights Watch, I've visited most of the detention facilities, east and west, and there were very few foreign fighters traditionally found in detention facilities, even post 2011. The detentions landscape in Libya, whether it's, authorities that can be seen almost as state authorities because they are under, at least nominally under the Justice Ministry, or whether it's detentions by the different military intelligence units that are armed groups, I would say it's a very violent landscape, very violent detentions landscape in general. People are systematically ill-treated, people are tortured, there are deaths in custody, there are horrendous, inhumane detentions conditions. And this is the case for almost everyone. I mean, there is as I said, it's a very, have people been singled out? Possibly, but the detentions landscape in general is a very violent one. I am not aware of the presence currently of PMCs in detention facilities. It might be the case. You'd have to ask the United Nations if they're aware that they are. But I would say that the concern from a humanitarian point of view, and from the based on what I said, my concern would extend to everyone being treated unlawfully, and particularly a concern with foreign fighters of judicial review, whether or not the mercenary stigma applies or not. Everybody's considered a mercenary. Everyone who's a foreigner is considered a mercenary in Libya, whether or not that's an actual legal term or not. So my concern would be for everyone held in detention, particularly people who were held for many years under the radar without any access to their families or without any access to anyone from their communities.
Thank you. I think there's two questions. I think one is, one is about the PMSCs. I think European or American PMSCs, and I think the question there is, do we see, and I think in the situation that you've covered, are there PMSCs from Europe or the United States active? And A and B, are they being, how are they being regulated in terms of the services they provide? I'm not sure if who wants to jump in on that one. Like, have you seen American or European PMSCs? I think is the question in a nutshell. Hanan.
Sorry, the question was to me and to Ahmed.
Yeah.
So we have come across multiple reports. We ourselves have investigated the presence of fighters who were affiliated with groups that appear to be contracted by the United Arab Emirates. To my recollection, these fighters were mostly from African countries. I'm not aware that there were contracted private military, from the United States or Europe. That said, I mentioned the Wagner Group and those fighters affiliated with the Russian private military company who remain in Libya and who operate in Libya.
Ahmed, maybe for you as well.
Yes, I mean, in Yemen, and giving the different level of conflicts, because we don't have just one conflict. We have multi-layered conflicts, and one of them is the U.S. war against terrorist groups in Yemen, namely Al-Qaeda. And we have seen some U.S. troops either in Mahra or in some other military bases, which are controlled by the Saudi-led coalition. But we have no idea about whether these troops are mercenaries, part of, private companies, or they are part of the American, army. But what other actually cases are telling us is that, for example, in Afghanistan, 65% of the military security operations were done by, private military and security operations, and we are seeing actually the same pattern in many areas by the US. Speaking about the UN working group, to my knowledge, I just saw a report about this matter, trying to come up with different kind of accountability framework to not regularize, but at least to have this kind of charter in order to legalize or to organize these kind of new trend in the military and security issues. But in Yemen, we're still far away actually from any sort of tangible results. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe, there was a question in the Q&A that I think was particularly looking at, the more foreign companies and governments as client of PMSCs in Libya. In Yemen. So maybe I'll merge the two, maybe with a question to Matthew. How do I think we've talked about the roles of I think we've covered the national framework, but obviously I think we've the three of you have also made a very coherent case that this is obviously also driven by regional dynamics. So how do you change the calculation of these regional dynamics around the use of PMSCs? I mean, what would there's clearly and the international norms, there's there's obligations for the contracting states, and I think you've mentioned some of them in the region and beyond. How do you change the calculation of these actors to in terms of how they use PMSCs for what purposes, to maybe limit human rights abuses? Like what would be the way to change the calculation of these regional actors? And I think if I link that with the second question, that's maybe for all the panelists. Private sector hiring, or foreign governments hiring PMSCs within Yemen to safeguard extraction site or embassies or other elements. How can you also make sure there that there's say human rights procurements of PMSCs? I mean, we're not talking necessarily of the procurement in the way you've talked about it before. I'm talking more about securing extractive sites, embassies, maybe humanitarian operations. But what can these clients as well do to make sure that PMSCs operate in a more human rights compliant way? So maybe Matthew on the regional actors, and then if all of you in terms of like what can we do of these other set of clients working in Yemen at present.
To be very brief, I think it's a losing argument to try and lecture the regional states on the use of private military contractors, because the last 10 or 20 years has shown experiences in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere that, and spyware industry, that these human rights abuses they carry on, and then realistically speaking, nothing really happens to them. How can you go and lecture Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, the UAE, whoever it is, using PMCs and undertaking these abuses when Western states do it as well? It's of course you need to be able to do it. You need to go through the aspects of security sector reform. You have to enhance and strengthen the judiciary society, but you're having a very tough discussion, not just with states engaging in Libya, but in Yemen, but also with the companies that often do this, where they've come from. It's endemic within the sector. Really, it's a difficult question. It's a difficult conversation to have, but it's extremely important because it's nearly synonymous. The problem comes really with attribution. And the only way in which this is coming into the second part, is trying to find a way to enforce that culture, those norms. And then the two examples that I mentioned earlier were Total and the Austrian oil company. Their exposure in Yemen with abuses on territory that they've owned, or they've had concessions to oil fields, the damage comes to their reputation. The damage comes to their business. That's how they enforce those norms. That's how they reduce their exposure, is by being linked to those abuses. So that then has to go hand in hand, whether than say, listen, this is happening on your territory, you should do something about this. You need to now go through a better legislated, a better designed, a better, stronger culture. But that's on a commercial level, something that's international, where the shareholders get impacted, by this, where they get legislated about it back in the government in Paris or in Vienna and London and Washington. Apart from that, it's going to be extremely difficult to enforce those norms. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Maybe Hanan or Ahmed, if you have any thoughts, on the issue of, I think, private sector clients or embassies, etc., but also, obviously, if you want to comment on the regional perspective, very welcome as well.
Okay. I think we need sorry, Hanan?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I think we need an international legal framework to hold not just the companies accountable, but also the governments that are using these companies, because we may have no idea what are these companies and what they are doing specifically in some conflicting zones. But what we can do is just to held these governments accountable about contracting with these companies or outsourcing with these companies. And this is actually on the international level. On the local level, I think it's complicated to deal with non-state actors. For example, how you can deal with the Houthis or other proxies on the ground. It's a bit difficult. But what we can do is that we can encourage some sort of international or local organizations, human rights organizations, to do some sort of campaigns against these actors who are violating human rights. Campaigns such as naming and shaming, I think it can help, not in the short term, but in the long term, of course. And one thing that we can do is to strengthen the local authorities institutions, for example, because this is actually a kind of contradiction. The more local authority or state security institutions we have, the less these kind of companies we can see. And the last thing, and I will end here, is it's important to look at what drives people to join this kind of entities. And one of these drivers is the economic needs. And I think we can work in some sort of developmental projects in areas that outside the conflict zones, in order to create some sort of economic opportunities for people. So we will see less people joining these kind of entities.
Maybe can I come in?
Yes,
with
please.
Just a last thought. So I want to just build on the excellent points made by Matthew and Ahmed, and very interesting suggestions and concrete suggestions on what to do. I think I would like us to look at it maybe also from another angle. There's a question there about the international framework on, a international legal framework on private military, private security and military companies, and whether or not that is important. I would underscore that it's important to have that discussion, and it's important to move it forward, just given that the type and the way that conflicts are being fought are slightly different. The idea of mercenarism isn't new. That's something that's been around for hundreds of years. It's not like a new concept. But the idea that we have these companies that are able to be registered in countries in a very opaque way, in a very complicated web, that are really escaping sort of the norm, and it's becoming very, very difficult to trace them and to trace where the money is coming from, I think, makes it important for us to have that discussion. But I do think that, and that's my last thought really, it's important to recall that really the onus here is on the contracting states. And the onus is to enact laws or to have laws that are really strong enough to address abuses by these private military companies or security companies, or both sometimes, as we know, and to address their complicity in serious human rights abuses, which is not always the case. It's not always the case that you have very strong laws, particularly in criminal law, sometimes doesn't adequately cover issues like torture and disappearances and unlawful detention. So, these issues come up everywhere. The issue of how private and military security companies are regulated come up in immigration law, they come up in labor law, there can be specific regulations even. So I would say that it's important to keep that in mind and important to not lose perspective that the contracting states very much so have an obligation. And obviously there's an individual criminal obligation for every person and every human being who participates in a conflict, not to torture, not to unlawfully kill, not to disappear, not to lay landmines that can kill kids and kill civilians. These are things that are known to us, but very often the framework is missing. And I think that it's a very important perspective to keep in mind while we have the very important discussion on a stronger international legal framework for private military companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think with that, I like to close the session. I think we could be discussing for a lot longer, but in all honesty, I think we've already covered a lot of ground in an hour. So I'd like to thank particularly our speakers, Hanan and Matthew and Ahmed for all their input. Thank you for sharing this with us. And I think it's a discussion to be continued. And from our side, maybe if I can just add, this is something that we have been following from TCAF on both, let's say, the countries, but also the international norms and good practices. We'll be continuing to work on this. They are, I think you made some very good points, Hanan. There are international norms and good practices that are already out there. Right now, I mean, there's discussion between should it be binding and not binding, but I think there's a key element there indeed on the obligations. I mean, I think we already have a certain understanding, I think, of the normative framework that would apply, whether it's binding or non-binding. I mean, the content is already pretty much established in terms of what obligations would be for states. I mean, right now it's soft law, but if it were to become binding, but I think the normative body is already being developed to a huge extent, and indeed there is a key obligation for not just the territorial state where the companies operate, but also the contracting states to fulfill, even in the current setting where we don't have a binding convention. But I think there's the normative body. I mean, the Montreux document right now has, for example, more signatures than the Mercenaries Convention. So there's already some normative body that could be of relevance there. We'll continue also from our side working on that. We'll continue the discussion, and just thanking all of you for taking the time. And we look forward to continuing the webinar series, particularly on these new forms of private military and security companies. Thank you so much.